Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that if you're returning. How are you today? Well, I promised you guys that we would start another series, and this series is about the Great Depression. So this book is called We Had Everything But Money. And this series is going to be more than 5 episodes, I can tell you that much. But I can guarantee you that it's going to be worth a lot more than what you think, and it's going to be very eye-opening, very educational, and I can't wait to get started. Okay, so when the banks closed, our hearts opened. So this is how it starts, okay? I was 9 years old in the Depression days when the banks closed in our little Illinois town. I believe Roosevelt called it a bank holiday, some holiday. You might wonder why a third grader would have any memory at all of a financial event. What could a kid have to lose? Well, I lost my life savings. It amounted to something in the order of $8 and change, as best I can remember. But it was pretty serious to me then. Fact was, the bank had closed and I was wiped out. The only reason I even had a savings account rather than the bicycle I really wanted was because the bank and our school promoted a savings program. It was supposed to teach us the virtues of thrift. It had taken me quite some time to amass my fortune. Small though it was, I carefully kept track of my money, dropping it dutifully into the little bank that my parents had given me. Then, on every Monday morning throughout the school year, I would bring my saved up nickels and dimes or whatever I happened to have in my pockets to school. Sometimes it was the savings from my bank. Other times it was money I'd earned doing chores over the weekend. Still other times it was a handout from a benevolent aunt or charitable uncle, or maybe even a birthday gift from Grandma and Grandpa. My deposits were recorded each week in my trusty passbook. The entries seemed to fill the book fast, but my savings grew slowly. Twice a year, the accrued interest, no princely sum, either at the 3% rate, common in those days, were entered. Watching my savings and interest accumulate, it slowly entered my mind that my chances of becoming John D. Rockefeller were somewhere between slim and none. But my calculations, it appeared that my personal fortune might pyramid to as much as $50 by the time I graduated from high school. It seemed like scant reward for a childhood of deprivation. To me, a nickel saved was, well, a Clark bar not enjoyed. Then came the day the banks closed. Preposterous. A bank was a place with guards and expensive furniture, brass bars in front of the tellers, and an enormous steel door guarding a vault where, insofar as I knew, my $8 was under safekeeping. I was wrong, and now I was ruined. Eventually, my bank reopened. The first depositors to be repaid were us school kids. Whether this was an uncommon stroke of public relations genius or simply a case of paying off the smallest depositors first is something I never found out. As you might suspect, my money did not go back into the bank. I put my life's assets into a mason jar, which I hid above some rafters high up in the corn crib. For years I had considerably more faith in mason jars than I did in the banks. Given the course of economic events in more recent times, it appears I may have been wise beyond my years. And that was written by Clancy Strock. With spending fork and popcorn, they survived. When the Great Depression first began, it was devastating for those who lost their jobs and their homes. Federal relief programs did not exist, and President Hoover refused to ask Congress for them or to approve any relief initiatives Congress itself proposed. Bank runs and failures increased. In 1931, more banks closed to prevent massive withdrawals. My mother and aunt each had a small inheritance in a bank that closed. My mother lost all her money. My aunt lost several $1,000s. As the Depression deepened in 1932, jobs were few and far between. More than 10 million Americans were out of work. Congress had promised World War I veterans a bonus payment for their service, but never delivered. Many of those veterans organized themselves as the bonus army and marched on Washington pleading, "Give us a bonus or give us a job." When breadwinners could no longer find work, the burden was so great that some men actually abandoned their families in hopes that charities would provide some assistance to help their loved ones get by. Many became part of the hobo population, riding boxcars from place to place and looking for work. They slept in barns, abandoned buildings, makeshift shelters, and hobo jungles close to the railroad tracks. Those who were lucky enough to find work would send for their families to join them. Others were never heard from again, and my father rode those rails looking for work. He'd take any job to make a few dollars to feed and clothe his family. He usually came home on weekends or as soon as he finished whatever short-term job he could find. Many times I woke up late at night or early in the morning to the smell of fresh cooked coffee and a cigarette smoke, and I knew that meant Dad was back home. Most of our backyard was planted in a garden throughout the 1930s. The garden was plowed with machinery. It wasn't plowed with machinery either. It was dug with a spading fork and tended with hands and a hoe. We always planted lots of popcorn. We 3 younger children usually had the job of shelling it. After that, we'd shift the corn from pan to pan as we blew up the shaft. And then we'd pop it off on top of the old cook stove and season it with bacon drippings and salt. It was a delicious Sunday afternoon treat. The Concord grapes on our arbor gave us delicious fruit and jam. Rhubarb was used for pies and sauces. We also ate rhubarb raw, dipped in a little sugar. Our family picked wild gooseberries and blackberries and gathered other fruit from my grandfather's farm. I especially remembered the delicious fresh cherry pies. In the fall, we gathered hazelnuts and hickory nuts and walnuts. And my father and older brother shelled the black walnuts and spread them on the roof of the shed to dry. Not all Americans had to struggle as we did. For those fortunate enough to keep their jobs or find new ones, life went on as usual. People who owned small businesses found life more difficult because collecting outstanding bills was almost impossible. A few of those rich folk carried on as though nothing had happened, but many used their resources to help those who were less fortunate. A new era dawned when President Roosevelt took office in 1933. When his inaugural address was broadcast over the radio, it gave new hope to millions of people. The only thing we have to fear, the president said, is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzed needed efforts to convert, retreat, and to advance. Neighbors pitched in after family lost the farm. My family will never forget the day the banks closed. My parents were farmers, and one day my mother hurried to the bank and deposited a check for about $1,200 just before closing. The bank was for a year's crop, and Mother kept out only $5 for groceries. In a few minutes, the bank was closed for good. The $5 was the only money my parents had left, but the store doesn't end there. My brother, who was 6, came home from school and went to his room to change clothes. The closet was dark, and he decided to strike a match. You can imagine the rest. My brother got out safely, but the house burned down to the ground. The family moved in with relatives temporarily, and one day my mother and father looked up and saw a caravan of cars coming, led by a car with a mattress tied on top. Their friends and neighbors were bringing whatever items they could spare from their own households to help them set up housekeeping again and Not long after that, Mother received word that her mother wanted her to come and visit. And when she arrived, she found a quilting party in progress in her honor. And the ladies spent the day making quilts to replace those that Mother had lost. The helping hands that assisted my parents encouraged them to keep farming. They stayed at it for many more years. Singer Lane, Reddington, California. That's beautiful. And depression hit us like a tornado. Everyone had their radios tuned in to the news when the bottom dropped out of the stock market. They listened closely that day and for many days to come. The wealthy were hit first, but it wasn't long before the depression came sweeping through our little town of Lenape, Kansas, like a tornado. The banks went broke and closed their doors. It was hard to believe the money we'd saved there was really gone. My father owned a general store, the kind where the sugar and beans came in barrels and were weighed out on scales, and I remember standing on the store's porch, watching the Union Pacific freight train roar through. Men filled the boxcars, sitting side by side, all seeking a new life somewhere, anywhere. Some men traveled by walking the tracks and others walking the roads. Many of these men came into the store to ask for food. My father always fed them. And as I watched those men driven by the forces of self-preservation, I thought about how lonely they must be, alone, and remembering the loved ones back home who were depending on them. Soon, there were bread lines, hungry people standing in lines a block long just to get a bite of food, and some of the missions offered one free meal a day. But they soon ran out of money too. Meanwhile, more businesses were closing. Smokeless factories carried for rent signs. The doors were closed. My father's store began to look like a gold mine with all the food lining the shelves. Some of my friends' families had been hit hard. They thought they were rich and that we had all the food we wanted. Little did they know, or I know, that my father was having sleepless nights just like everyone else. He, too, was being swept up by the great waves of the Depression and was about to go under. The whole world seemed to be sliding into a great dark place. In 1933, my father had to close the store. We moved to some property my father owned, and the Depression continued until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Just after the United States declared war on Japan, news came that an ammunition plant would be built near us. It seemed to go up overnight, and it was huge. We had never seen anything so large before. Men flocked to the town by the carload. There was hardly room to walk on the sidewalk, and my aunt owned a restaurant in town, and it got so busy that people didn't even have room to sit down. They ate their food standing up out on the streets under the shade trees and in their cars. And the men who came to work at the ammunition plant had nowhere to sleep either. Some slept in their cars. All on the sidewalks were filled with cots for them. The plant ran day and night. The employment problem had vanished. Everyone had jobs and money began to flow again. There was wildness in the air. Spirits were high. Everyone felt relieved and free. The Depression was over. I was teaching in a small town. I got my monthly paycheck on Good Friday. I didn't get to the bank until Saturday, and the cashier asked if I wanted to deposit the check or just take the cash. I said, for no particular reason, I would take the cash. I was lucky to have a month's pay in my hands because the bank closed that Monday. Inez M. Warren, Syracuse, Nebraska. Children's efforts made a difference. Memories of the Great Depression vary with each of us depending on where and how we lived. I was living on a small farm near Clinton, Maine, where we had a few cows and a large wood lot. Unlike many families in the city, we never knew what it was like to be hungry or cold. We had little or no money, but neither did any of our neighbors on the surrounding farms, so we never felt we were suffering. Like all farm children, my sister and I were expected to do whatever we could to help out around the farm. In early years, we needed the garden, and we helped keep the wood box filled up, and we washed the dishes after all our meals and did other family chores. There was never any thought of being paid for what we did, and there was no such thing as an allowance. We accepted that what we did was part of making a living. Children who had enough to eat and clothes to keep warm felt lucky. Most of us knew families in towns and cities who had much less. At age 8, I started helping to milk the cows, and I was proud when I was able to turn the separator to move the cream, and Mother made her own butter, and I helped with that too, and the butter was traded in town for staples like salt and flour and sugar. Little money ever changed hands. I liked to hunt and fish, and after selling cloverine salve to buy a .22 caliber rifle at age 12, I helped to fill the family larder with a variety of game, including grouse and snowshoe hares and squirrels. And we had a trout stream near in our home, and I often brought home enough trout for dinner. That was on days when it was raining hard to work outside. I don't remember that it would ever rain so hard to fish. About the same time, I began trapping fur-bearing animals to raise a few extra dollars. During Christmas vacation when I was 13, I trapped ermine that sold for more than $60. What a windfall. To give you an idea of how much money that was for a kid to earn, my father had hired 2 men who were helping him cut pulpwood for paper. Those men were paid $20 a month plus board. By age 15, I was hunting for larger game like deer. The gun, steel trap, and fishing pole were not recreational tools. They were what helped us put food on the table. The depression was still with us when I got married. I don't know whether I was stupid or brave back in those years. But after we paid the preacher, my young wife and I had only $5 to start our married life, but we also had supreme faith in ourselves and our future. As we look back now on those long ago years, we realized that we weren't all that bad. We not only survived, we may well have become better and stronger people for that experience. Too many people, the life I lived in the late 1920s and early 30s, would seem to be one of the hardships of privation. But I thought I was having a wonderful time. Of course, there were times I thought I might have agreed. Like when my sister and I were out in the mudflats outside our small town on the Oregon coast digging clams by lantern light in the fog. But there was a great deal of satisfaction in lugging those buckets of clams home to our mother. She'd help us clean the clams and pack them into quart jars, and we'd sell them to hotels and restaurants. We also caught Dungeness crabs in ring nets from the pier and sold them for 10 to 15 cents a piece. It was pretty tough work for girls of 11 and 13. We catch the crabs day and night whenever the tide was right, then boil them in 5-gallon tin can over an outdoor fire and sell them by the roadside stand in front of our little 3-room shack. As we grew older, we earned money in other ways. We made fudge and sold it to mill workers at lunchtime. We made flowers from beads and sold them door to door. We kept our eyes peeled for every scrap we could find of brass, copper, aluminum, which brought a few extra dollars from the junk dealer. Mostly, though, it was the clams and crabs that saw us through the Depression years, and I always remember them with a smile. Saxton Morris, Cape Junction, Oregon. It's beautiful. These stories are absolutely beautiful. The years of 1938 through 1940 were tough ones for many American families who had survived the Depression by changing their lifestyles. Many households were like ours, where father, mother, children, aunts, uncles, and grandma lived together in one large house, and more jobs were available then, and everyone worked, but the jobs paid little, and there were no extra money for kid stuff. And in our house, there were 4 kids. And my younger brother, Bobby, and I could gauge a nickel or two, and then we would redeem pop bottles at the grocery store for candy money. But money for the movies was out of the question. Admission was a dime each, and I was 9 and Bobby was 7, so we were too young to get jobs. We thought our problem was solved when our neighbor's son, who was about 14, suggested we sell newspapers for him. Leo was a corner captain, a position developed by the newspapers to organize crews of newsboys and supervise sales on downtown street corners. Papers sold for 3 cents each, and the newsboys kept a penny for each paper they sold. The only hitch in our plan was Mom, who advanced every possible argument against it. We were too young downtown, was too far from home, and we could get run over, Mom stuff. Leo went to bat for us and assured her he'd look out for us, and Leo was the kind of guy your mother would trust, and Mom finally agreed on one condition, that Bobby and I would turn our earnings over to her every night to be saved in a piggy bank. We'd get a dime on Sunday to go to the movies. We started selling papers, and we looked forward to going to work every afternoon after school. I'm still not sure what Bobby had going for him, but he could sell 3 papers for every one I sold. Maybe it was because he was smaller. Maybe he was more persistent. Or maybe he just yelled louder. If you wanted to make any money, you had to hustle. Every passerby and store employee was a prospect, and my corner was the site of a huge Sears store, and traffic was heavy. It wasn't too hard to sell my allotment of papers, although it took me longer than Bobby, and I often had to go back to Leo's corner for more. Weekdays were the best. On Saturdays, the evening papers came out earlier. We had to go to work longer to sell the same number of papers we sold on weekdays. And later, when we were older, we earned good money selling Sunday morning papers, which came off the presses at 11 p.m. Saturday. It was wonderful to remember how marvelously busy those downtown streets were on a Saturday night. Extra editions brought us our best sales, and we come home with our pockets full of change. And the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the circulation manager called in all the newsboys to sell extras, and every newsboy was excused from school on that day. We weren't restricted to our usual corners, but could sell anywhere in town. Almost everybody we saw bought a paper. There were some good learning experiences we had them 50 years ago, and a few Huck Finn-style adventures, too. Wow. All right, guys. That's it for episode 1, okay? I will see you in the next episode. I love you. Stay safe. Stay positive. Keep prepping. And as always, fearless.